As we approach the end of the calendar year, the days grow shorter as the sun sinks lower and lower in the sky, rising farther south along the horizon each day until it sinks to its lowest point. It seems to hold there, rising from the same spot each morning until finally, on the third day, near the end of December, it rises a little to the north of where it had the previous morning. Each day thereafter, it moves farther north, climbing higher in the sky as the days grow longer. To us, it's an obscure astronomical fact that seems to coincide with the holidays. But to ancient cultures, the reverse was the case. And there will be a great many such reversals in this episode. The holiday was meant to coincide with the celestial event. It was a time to celebrate the return of light and the eventual end of winter. It marked the imminent arrival of spring and the rebirth of the land. Because, for 3 short days, or rather 3 long nights, it was the darkness that ruled, and it was the moon which was prominent. It was a time of death that preceded life, a time of darkness that preceded light, a time of chaos which preceded order. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. Christmas is a time for celebration and sharing, for visiting family and eating unhealthy food, for exchanging gifts and going to church. Now, I'm not one for church, for obvious reasons, and my family lives 1,000 miles away, but I'm down for the rest of the traditions, especially the food part. But where did those traditions come from? If we take a quick look back at the history of Christmas and the associated practices, things get a little confusing. We have a tradition that the Christmas tree is a symbol of eternal life, promised to us by the sacrifice of Jesus. When his blood fell on the cross, it transformed that particular species of tree so that it would no longer die in the winter. I'm not making this up. I've actually heard this story. But if we try to pin down a date for this story, we run into trouble. Christmas trees weren't even widely used by Christians until fairly recently. The practice of decorating an evergreen tree came from Germany and was adopted by the Christians sometime during the 16th century, though the practice was condemned by many denominations for centuries. An 1853 article on Christmas stated that the holiday, quote, is not much celebrated, unquote, in New England, but it was popular in Pennsylvania. The Vatican outright banned the use of trees for Christmas celebrations, citing their pagan origins as the reason. The first tree erected in St. Peter's Square didn't even go up until 1982, just a few months after I received my first haircut. So let's take a look at the different details associated with the modern celebration of Christmas and start rolling back the clock to find their origins. According to the Gospels, a king is found among the peasants and is given gifts by the wealthy. In this case, a group of visiting kings or wise men. The date is December 25th, and this child will be the light of the world. He's a dying and rising God, and his life is linked to the vitality of the world, and he alone can grant us eternal life. This, of course, will require a sacrifice in which he will die and descend into the underworld for 3 days, but he'll rise again, so don't worry. His birth will start a new age, the beginning of a new era. To celebrate, we'll decorate evergreen trees with lights and string up mistletoe. We'll hang up wreaths on our doors and light a fire. We'll hold parades in which celebrants will dress up in costumes, and carolers will travel from house to house singing hymns associated with the celebration, and we'll exchange gifts. There will be feasts, usually involving ham, and that annoying song, The 12 Days of Christmas, will play in every store. Santa Claus will be in attendance so children can sit on his lap, and in a few places, Krampus will chase people through the streets and spank them with switches. Did I leave anything out? Probably, but I think I've included enough details for you to recognize the description as the holiday we call Christmas. So let's start with the most recognizable figure in Christmas tradition, Santa Claus. He's red, he's fat, he's jolly, and he's the embodiment of innocence. Well, I did tell you there'd be some reversals in this episode. Tradition tells us that Santa Claus is based on St. Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra, who was present at the Council of Nicaea, but was evicted after a feud with Arius. His feast day, according to the Catholic calendar, is December 19th. He's famous for visiting a poor man who couldn't afford dowry for his 3 daughters and giving them valuable gifts to help them marry. All of this makes for a pretty good historical origin story for Santa Claus. Unfortunately, none of what I just said is true. Well, except for the Bishop of Myra part, which is literally the only thing we know about the historical St. Nicholas. We can't even place him at the Council of Nicaea, as he is actually absent from the role of bishops. It seems that the feud with Arius was invented by monks about 4 centuries ago to explain the reason for St. Nicholas being absent from a convention he should have attended. Actually, the Bishop of Myra wasn't even originally associated with Santa Claus. That's right, we actually have a Christmas guy with a separate origin who was later merged with St. Nicholas, but he wasn't dressed in red, nor was he saintly. Nor did he give gifts to the poor, at least not originally. That story, the gifts to the 3 daughters for their dowry, actually comes from a story about Apollonius of Tyana, a Greek philosopher who died around 100 CE. His charity story was lifted and applied to St. Nick many centuries later. Actually, there are stories of Apollonius that are also used for Jesus. So yeah, the stories for Santa Claus and Jesus actually came from one Greek philosopher. But even before Apollonius, Santa was roaming the countryside. The exact dates of his origin are unknown, as their traditions predate written history in Europe. Yeah, Father Christmas is that old. Originally, he was the wild man, a sort of forest god characterized by hooves, horns, fur, and an insatiable appetite for both food and sex. Sound familiar? He was the ancient European spirit that inspired Pan. He was a remnant of an older time when civilization and safety ended at the edge of the fire's light. Like any good forest god, he was linked to the cycle of nature and the fertility of the land, which meant he would die in the winter and be reborn in the spring. Ancient rituals were held annually to lure this forest god from his home in the wilds. Here's how it worked. Near the end of the year, when the days were shortest, the god would be lured from the forest by the civilized folk, using the thing most likely to attract something so primal, a maiden. Of course, this wasn't any actual beast, but a person dressed in furs and horns playing the part of the wild man. He also carried a phallus, either carved from wood, sculpted from clay, or one actually taken from a slain animal. Once he was drawn out of hiding, he'd be captured and bound and then marched to the middle of the village, where he would be the centerpiece of their annual celebration. There would most likely be a large fire to drive away the darkness, as this was the entire point of the ritual. It was all about the ending of the long nights and the bringing about of the spring. Near the end of the celebration, the wild man, who was usually a leader like a chief, would publicly copulate with the maiden who had lured him into the trap. This would symbolize the fertilization of the land. Once complete, a mock execution would commence and the wild man would be slain. Then a medicine man would revive him, restoring the wild man to life, just as nature would soon be restored. He'd be free from his bonds and then return into the forest, bringing life back into the trees. The amount of realism varied greatly. In some instances, the wild man was the local leader, like a chief, and he would actually have sex with a woman. In others, the practice was simulated. Sometimes the man was actually sacrificed, meaning he might have been a criminal or someone captured in battle, and the rebirth was achieved through the impregnation of the woman in the ritual with the child of the nature god. The symbolic death and rebirth of the god, in a visual fashion, gave hope for the people that the dead world would soon be reborn and the darkness would come to an end. This wild man would also influence another familiar deity from Europe, the Norse god Odin. Dressed in a long robe and long hat to protect against the cold, the white-bearded father of the gods rode an 8-legged flying horse named Sleipnir. Like the wild man, Odin descends to the underworld and is closely linked with the cycle of nature and the sun. It's from him that Santa receives much of his modern appearance. And it's from the Norse traditions of Yule that Christians borrowed many of the practices we associate with Christmas today. One of the common names for the wild man of the woods in ancient German folklore was Klaus. This Klaus, depicted as a furry wild man with horns and hooves, soon appears alongside St. Nicholas in Christmas traditions. When we shorten the name Nicholas, we used the form Nick, but the old German shortening for Nicholas was Klaus. So it didn't take long for the wild man Klaus and his companion St. Nicholas to be merged into one, creating Sinterklaas. But the Germans liked their wild man so much that they held on to him as a separate entity and renamed him Krampus. The civilized form and wild form evolved in parallel and merged again with the Pennsylvania Dutch to create Belsnickel, a short, furry, impish figure who delivered gifts but also punished disobedient children. He was like the wild man, only smaller. Much smaller. About the size of a garden gnome. And it's he who originally appears in Clement Clarke Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, in 1823. The earliest artwork associated with that poem depicts a small elf, not a large fat man. Just listen to the lines of that poem. With a little old driver so lively and quick, and he was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. Even his reindeer are said to be tiny and pulling a miniature sleigh. Now, some people argue here that it's from Odin's horse with 8 legs that Moore gets the idea for giving Santa 8 reindeer. But I've searched this and I can find no evidence to support this idea. And by this time, the Odin connection was mostly forgotten, so connecting the 8 reindeer to Sleipnir's 8 legs is pure speculation and likely nothing more than coincidence. Later, Santa once again becomes more like Odin, a full-size man in long robes and a white beard. He was depicted with different clothes, sometimes red or green, but usually muted colors like brown, and almost always dressed in furs, or in some kind of cloth with fur trim. And then, in 1931, Coca-Cola cemented Santa's image in his red and white outfit. Now, they didn't invent the look. A fat Santa with a white beard dressed in a red suit with white trim had existed for several decades by this point. Coca-Cola selected that color scheme from the various popular depictions because it matched their logo. The ads standardized the design for Santa, and that design has been featured in Coca-Cola ads for nearly a century. Now, if we follow the trail backward, along the path of Odin through German and Norse history, we come to the celebration of Yule. Great evergreen trees were felled and used to fuel a communal fire around which townspeople would gather to celebrate, and boars were roasted and shared. The celebrants went about town singing. It's from this celebration that we get the Yule log, the Yule ham, and Yule singing. Evergreen boughs were hung about to represent rebirth, and animal blood was sprinkled to symbolize fertility. After 3 nights of celebration, the festivities would come to an end. The evergreen tree was burned down to ash, dying as all things must. But the new year was coming in, with spring following close behind. But before Christians were influenced by the Northern Europeans, they were borrowing traditions from the Romans, which should come as no surprise as it was within the Roman Empire that Christianity was born. I'm of course talking about the celebration of Saturnalia. Now don't confuse that with the modern Saturnalia, the annual sex holiday that makes good use of the longest night of the year. I'm referring to the ancient Roman holiday honoring the god Saturn. It was held from December 17th through December 23rd and involved giving gifts, feasts, hanging of mistletoe along with other fertility symbols, lighting the city with candles and torches, hanging up wreaths, garlands, and of course, decorating evergreen trees. Now, these decorations included suns, stars, and images of their gods, but the trees were not cut down and brought inside. That was invented by the Germans. For Saturnalia, the evergreen trees were decorated where they grew. Gladiator games were also held, prompting many scholars to speculate that older traditions may have involved human sacrifice, and the more modern gladiator games served as a replacement for that practice, though no direct evidence to support the hypothesis has been found. Two other things of note are the role reversals and the mock king. Feast tables were set out, and masters brought in food and wine to serve to their slaves. A king of Saturnalia was elected, usually from the lowest member of each household or gathering. This individual presided over the festivities and was given free rein to engage in mischief. While the fertility symbols and decorating with lights both have a clear meaning here, the desire to see light return to the world and the land become more fertile, the role reversals and the mock king have no Roman point of origin. That's because they're not originally Roman practices. They're older. Much, much older. We could go back to Sacaea, a midwinter New Year's festival instituted by Cyrus the Great. Masters served food to their slaves, roles were reversed, and a criminal was elected to the role of a mock king. This king would feast and celebrate for 5 days before being stripped of his finery and executed. Now, we shouldn't be surprised for Cyrus to pop up in this podcast again, but this isn't where this tradition began. To find the true origins of Christmas, we have to go back to the dawn of civilization itself. We have to roll back the clock to a time when most of the world's cities were between two rivers in the Middle East. New Year's celebrations held in midwinter were held in every city, each dedicated to a different god or goddesses. These date back 6,000 years, and the most well-documented was the festival of Zagmuk. Zagmuk was a Babylonian festival, though it was derived from older Sumerian traditions that predate the building of that city by a couple thousand years. The festival lasted for the last 12 days of the year, when the nights were longest. At the beginning of the festival, the king was stripped of his title and power by the priest. A criminal would then become the mock king for the next 12 days. During this time, the priest would recite an epic which detailed the battle between Marduk and Tiamat along with the other forces of chaos. In the story, Marduk would battle chaos for 12 days. The god would die in this battle and descend into the underworld before returning triumphant and reborn. This mirrored the solar cycle as the sun dropped low and then began climbing again after the winter solstice. The mock king was dressed in finery and given all the luxuries of a real king, and on the 10th day of the festival, he would engage in ritual intercourse with the high priestess to reenact the divine coupling of Marduk and Sarpanatu, though this part of the festival may have been performed by the actual king. Sources are a bit unclear as to who exactly did what. At the end of the festival, the mock king was executed so he could be sent down to the underworld and aid Marduk in the struggle against the forces of chaos. This occurred because it was believed that the king was linked to the cycle of nature and thus held divine powers, notably those of fertility. The real king would then kneel before the priest and swear to the now victorious Marduk to always act in accordance to Marduk's will. During the celebration, the wealthy would give to the poor, and so we see many of the traditions which would later appear in Saturnalia. People exchanged gifts and gather around bonfires. Feasts were held, along with parades through the city in which the participants dressed in costumes. The criminal becomes king and is later stripped before his sacrifice and is sent into the underworld to battle the darkness. Even this tradition has survived into modern times, as we read in Matthew chapter 27, verses 28 to 29, when Jesus, condemned as a criminal, is dressed in a royal robe and given a fake scepter and crown. He is mockingly called king before later being stripped of his finery and executed. so that he can descend into the underworld, defeat the forces of darkness, and return 3 days later on a solar holiday, reborn and bringing with him the promise of eternal life to the world. The reason Zagmuk was 12 days long was to round out the calendar of 353 or 354 days, which was based on a lunar cycle. And speaking of moons, originally this was a festival about the moon goddess Inanna and her descent into the underworld. It was held during a time of darkness, when the sky was ruled by the moon. But the matriarchal celebration was stamped out by the priests of Marduk, and, like much else, the roles were reversed. But the connection doesn't end there. In one version of the story, a god named Tammuz was killed by a wild boar and bled out on a tree stump. Worshippers would include a boar in their feast, and it was said that his divine blood caused the felled tree to regrow, and that tree became the first evergreen. The cave outside of Bethlehem, where Jesus was supposedly born, and where the Church of the Nativity now stands, sat beneath a grove of trees. That grove, according to a letter written by St. Jerome, the man who first translated the Bible into Latin, was called the Grove of Tammuz. I hope you enjoyed this little trip back in time and found it informative. Remember to subscribe to the podcast. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. Head over to the website at dragonsandgenesis.com where you can contact me with any questions or comments. Leave us a good review on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast. Until next time, have a Merry Christmas and thank you for listening.